Welcome back, everyone, to the 2023 Nasher Prize Dialogues Graduate Symposium, where we have been exploring the work and influence of the 2023 Nasher Prize laureate, Singa Ngugi. I am Dr. Lauren Cross, your moderator, and for those who are just joining us for the first time, this week we've enjoyed a lot of wonderful conversation exploring the themes, critical themes, and practices within Ngugi's work, the impact of her artistry, her use of materials, and yesterday we heard about her collaboration as a key feature within her work. So if you've missed any of the presentations, feel free to go back to those original links so that you can view our wonderful presenters and get keyed into that research. Today, I have the privilege of leading our roundtable discussion with our participants and to expound on some of the topics that they covered this week, to discuss some of their questions, and then to discuss things that maybe weren't covered in the week's discussions. And then immediately after our roundtable discussion, we'll have a dynamic and exciting keynote lecture by the award-winning scholar and curator, Dr. Kellie Jones. And so I hope that you stay on and tune in to hear that wonderful presentation. I know I'm very excited to tune in myself. So at this time, I want to reintroduce our symposium participants on our roundtable. First, we have Fabiola Carenza from the University of California, San Diego, who gave an awesome presentation on elasticity in Ngugi's work in day one. Abril Cisneros Ramirez from Leiden University in the Netherlands gave a talk about resiliency in Ngugi's work, and particularly RSVP. And then we had Lydia Ferreira from the University of California, Los Angeles, who talked about remaking, and particularly the RSVP series and its ongoing investigations. And then yesterday, we had Michaela Gray and Zoe Roden from Texas Tech University, and they talked about collaboration. So just kind of giving you a brief overview of what they talked about. All of these panelists brought forth some really fascinating and wonderful perspectives, compelling perspectives for us to consider in their interpretation of Ngugi's work, and carved out, what's groundbreaking really about her practice and impactful for the field of sculpture. So I want to thank you all for doing that important work and presenting that important information to us this week. So for our roundtable, I have a few initial questions that I want to ask to kind of kick us off. And then I want to invite our panelists, if you have any reflections or questions that you like to ask each other, I want to invite you to do that as well. And then there may be some of you in the audience that have some questions as well. So we want to leave some space for that. So without further ado, let's get started. So first, I would like to ask our panelists, what drew you to Ngugi's work and what inspired you to investigate your particular approach in your research? I'm going to go with Fabiola first.
Hi, that's a great question. I think one of the things that first drew me to Ngugi's work was an encounter with a show that exhibited one of her sculptures. And I'd seen so many other people since, kind of take nylon on as a material, and finding out that she'd done this in the 1970s just kind of blew me away. So that was the first encounter I ever had. I think it was at LACMA, it might have been somewhere else. I honestly don't remember, but I remember seeing the piece and just so many meticulously tied knots around it. And in terms of like my methodology, I kind of come to art history as an artist. So I think my approach is not linear, and it's not academic in the traditional sense of like following a paper structure that's very cohesive and argumentative or comparative. but I do like chasing images. And I think that then later, just an art store, I discovered this drawing that she made of a hurricane or like a twister, and I just kind of rolled with it and became very fascinated with all the kind of thinking and philosophical discourse that you could kind of conjure based on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Fabiola. Next, I'm going to ask the same question to Lydia.
Sure. Thanks, Dr. Cross. I think unlike Fabiola, I actually encountered Nenguti's work through scholarship on her and Dr. Jones' scholarship and recent curatorial presentations of her work. And it was through that encounter, the way her works sit in the historical record, that I started asking questions about how is it that we have access to these sculptures today? How is it that they're getting on view? How is it that they're circulating in exhibitions? And how is it that Nenguti's reception is as it is today? So those kinds of questions guided my thinking and my research around her return to RSVP in the early 2000s and the way that that's shaped the life of those works. Since I think in terms of my approach, thinking about the way artworks live in the world requires more than just a purely art historical or theoretical lens. I try and think about really practical material concerns, and conservation helps me think about that, as does thinking about tools offered by performance studies. And I try and bridge the gaps between those disciplines and art history. And I think Nenguti's work asks us to do that in many ways.
Yes, I love all of what you just said. Just that interdisciplinary nature within her work invites all kinds of different types of conversations. So that's excellent. Ariel, what about yourself?
Thank you for your question, Dr. Cross. I also encountered Nenguti's work through scholarship, especially Dr. Ball's elaborations on the criticality of friendship in her practice. And this was because I wrote my bachelor's thesis on radical mirth. So I was just exploring scholarship on friendship and happiness. And I encountered Nenguti's work and I got really interested in it, especially in relation to also how to combine sculpture and performance in terms of archival materials and embodied practice. From the perspective of Diana Taylor's elaborations on embodied practice and how Nenguti's work exists really in between what can be kept and what disappears. But then I decided to go with indigenous epistemologies just as a way to try something new, really. I had been working with new materialisms, but then I encountered critique on new materialisms and their parallels with indigenous epistemology. And I think the reason was just that I decided to listen to that decolonial critique and go directly with indigenous epistemologies to investigate what materials do and the agency of materials, how materials affect viewers. So that's it. Yeah.
Very nice, very nice. And then looking at everyone's faces here, Michaela, I'll go with Michaela first, and then Zoe, you can chime in next.
Yeah, thanks so much, Dr. Cross. I think what drew Zoe and I, and also just myself, to Senga Nenguti's work initially was the fact that Zoe and I have been collaborators in a curatorial and humanities scholarship practice for nearly 3 years now. And I think we really closely identified with Senga Nenguti and specifically her collaboration with Maren Hossinger and how their practice and the way they talk about their practice neither comes to collaboration as a total disintegration of the self into like a singular persona, nor is it about differentiating like what belongs to who within their practice. It's this non-linear and non-physical collaboration with memory and each other across distances. And I think that really resonates the way Zoe and I think about our practice. And while we're not artists necessarily, I think having models of how people do that historically is really significant to us. So, yeah.
And Zoe?
Yeah, I mean, Michaela took the words out of my mouth. I think we really look to them for how to put language to our own practice. As humanities researchers who share a collaborative practice, there's this tendency for people to request what belongs to whom or who wrote which section. And Hassinger and Nguti's work and their practice being collaborative and also them working in the same discipline has been really inspiring to us. So it was such a joy to work on side by side.
Very nice. I think what I'm excited to hear from each of you is how your own, thinking about Nguti and how the personal is political, that, for each of you, your own personal journeys also brought you to her work and also helps to frame some of your interests. And I always find that as a scholar, probably even more interesting to kind of dig behind and be like, what drew this person to this? So it's excited to see that connection. So my next question is definitely thinking about theory and framework, and you all brought forth very different theories and frameworks, which I thought was excellent, to be able to look at one artist through so many different lenses. So there are a lot of, great theories essentially that we can use to kind of explain her work. We talked about elasticity, conceptual art, radical reconceptualism, contextualism, I think one of you talked about as an example. Are there, in your investigation, are there some areas that maybe people don't tend to look at within her work that maybe should be addressed within the context of her work? So was there anything maybe in your investigation? I know for me, like sometimes, I'm focusing on a particular research question. So, some theories don't always like fit within the line of what I'm trying to talk about. But is there anything that you wanted to add basically to the conversation that hasn't been mentioned so far? And I'll start with Zoe this time, going in the direct opposite order.
Yeah, I mean, working with Nguti's work with video and film was something that was really interesting for us. And then also the decision to extend her video work and think about it as a sketch. I think there's a lot of potential for continuities in Nguti's work that stretches across these disciplines and mediums. And obviously her work with sculpture is so prolific. But I think examining them alongside one another as opposed to segmented is something that we found really productive in our own writing.
Michaela?
Yeah, I'll just quickly add on to that. I think to reiterate something Dr. Sirota said in the introduction to today's conversation, I think it's really important to attend to not just Nguti's work in the 1970s, but also attend to her contemporary work, which was something really important to Zoe and I. And I think we specifically really found generative in Lydia's presentation yesterday, this idea of remaking and reiterations, and how RSVP is like renewed in its meaning each time it's made. So, yeah.
And I saw Lydia's hand. Did you want to?
Right. I got excited. So I wanted to jump in, and I got really excited when you, Michaela and Zoe, introduced Bergson. And I was thinking, what is it about Nguti's work that makes us want to theorize the way it, or theorize its time, try and, I feel like her work wants us, or it's slippery in that way. It kind of evades certainly evades linear time. In many ways, it also evades cyclical time. And when I heard Bergson in your talk, I thought it was fascinating because that model is of Dore is kind of the polar opposite to iteration in many ways. Iteration as a kind of episodic, punctuated time versus Bergson's as linear or durational, undifferentiated flow. So I don't know if what you guys thought about that. Perhaps both can be useful. The fact that her works seem to welcome both models is fascinating in and of itself. So, or if any, Fabiola or Abriel, if that struck a chord with either of you, I don't know. So.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just
Sorry.
going to open it up if anyone wanted to respond to Lydia's question.
Yeah, I think, definitely thinking about time is something that from the get-go became important around rethinking and thinking of this works in many ways, because so much of the work kind of relies on the ideas of serialization, but also you talked about drawing and sort of ties between drawing, choreography, and perhaps, like sketching, that all these things are kind of technologies or processes for making and thinking. I thought that to me was interesting, but I think for me at the core of my exploration is an interest for reception theory and how that can be read alongside Nanguri's work, and also finding a theory that could connect psychic and material expression. I think that was important for me, which is why I brought the Catherine Malibu into play and the concept of plasticity.
I just want to jump in relation to this notion of drawing. I really like that. It reminded me of the notion of the trace, which hasn't been that theorized, I think, in terms of sculpture. More, I've seen it in relation to, for example, the work of Alora and Calzadilla, which is more film. But this way of linking presence and absence and inscription and eraser, I think it fits very well with Nenguri's work. So I think it was a wonderful comparison to frame her work as this thing that can be hinted at but not truly grasped.
Okay. Any other responses to Lydia's question? Just want to make sure that no one's left out there. So yes, I was definitely that hit home for me as well. That quote of her sculpture as a sketch really stood out to me in that body of work as well. An extension to my last question is just this notion of, like, a lot has been said about like the politics behind her work and her specific approach to politics in comparison to maybe other artists, in that sort of genre of working. I wondered, how theories like Black feminism, womanist thought, and praxis, or women of color feminism more broadly, because she's kind of been in those conversations as well. Were those theories that kind of came up, or that you were interested in exploring more in the context of her work? Or did you feel like, well, that's kind of already been done, and this kind of creates an opportunity to explore other avenues in terms of the politics? Just wondered what your thoughts were about these sort of identity-specific kinds of theories as a lens for interpreting. And I'm going to go with, Fabiola. Yes.
Oh, I'm just happy to kind of weigh into my logic for maybe not immediately going there. On the one hand, I felt that the idea of reading her work explicitly as work made by a Black artist would do a kind of disservice to what I feel are universalizing principles in the work. But I definitely, certain things came to my mind, like just the nature of, the events that she would have lived through in LA, and tying that to things like the, like the notion of futurity or Afrofuturity, or like that's more recent to my learning, but also the Congahi River Collective and things that maybe would have been happening at the same time where she would have been making this artworks. And I think, I kept grasping between wanting to read this from a like second and third and fourth wave feminist position and trying to find a way that I could do a future service to the work rather than a historicizing service. I don't know if that's helpful, but that was my reasoning.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And I appreciate you mentioning like that that dynamic of, will certain theories help to, help to frame an artist's work, or could it potentially take away? So I appreciate you mentioning that, because I think that's important for us to, see the balance in that conversation. But I love that it also kind of poses us to kind of think, well, like, could it help still even within that? So kind of stretching ourselves to see it as a both and, right? Yes, so that sounds great. Yes, Abria, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I think the framework I used might seem very far removed from this kind of frameworks, but the idea to conceive her sculptures as resilient and as resistant just by the fact that they exist in this in-between space, between mediums, between styles, reminded me a lot of this quote. I think it's in her interview with the Smithsonian Archive, but I'm not sure. But she says that to be born Black in America is an act of resistance in itself. So to me, that triggered this parallel thinking of her sculptures being in this in-between back then and even now, to be so uncategorizable that in that very fact of being there, they resist somehow.
I love that quote. Lydia?
Sure. I just wanted to jump in and kind of add that I think for in relation to my work, which is thinking about questions of historicization and reception and the way the kind of historical or documentary footprint around Nenguti's works necessarily, of course, raises questions of identity, authorship, Nenguti's own identity as a Black woman working from the 70s and today. And your question made me think of a quote she mentioned, I think in a letter she wrote, perhaps to her gallerist in the 90s, where she registered her awareness of establishing her work as a model, her historical work as a model for Black artists living and working today. And so I sort of conceive of my presentation here as a starting point for continuing to think through the ways that kind of a historical return intersects with questions of identity and Nenguti's own kind of commitment to historicizing her own work so that it could serve as a model for others. So wanted to add that.
Yeah, I think that's a powerful connection there. And I think it's powerful, especially, considering she is the first Black woman Nasher Prize laureate to acknowledge and think about how her identity, fits in within this conversation historically, and then also within the present, so that future artists can see, how do I fit within, or how could I also use the, historicizing my own work as a framework for my practice. So thank you all for that. And then I want to go to Michaela and Zoe. What are your thoughts from maybe from collaboration or other ideas? I think that was an excellent connection there.
Yeah, I mean, we initially started our methodology just by doing a formal analysis of the film, in part because of a lack of access to archives, because there is so little material online. But thinking about her own collaboration, these issues of identity were at the very center. She initially reached out to Marianne Hossinger because she was the first Black woman to have a gallery show at Arco Center. And they, I think, formed their relationship around this shared identity, or at least they've mentioned that quite a bit in interviews. So I think I want to echo what Fabiola said about like not universalizing anything or using this as like our entry point in, but it was very much at the center of our work.
Yeah, just to add on to what Zoe said, yeah, as much as that was at the center of our inquiry, we felt like the personal contribution to which we could like bring to the table was one through our shared experiences as collaborators. So it was sort of like holding these two things in both hands, to reiterate what everyone was so eloquently speaking about.
Awesome. Excellent. So I want to give some wholesome space for each of you. You may have questions for one another as you were listening to each other's presentations. Were there any questions that you had towards your fellow panelists that you wanted to ask? I think Lydia, I see your hand.
I have another one, sort of relating to my comment earlier about models of time, which is open, of course, to everyone. I just wanted to return to the question of documentation and the status of documentation for Nenguti's work and her body of work, and return to this notion of performance documentation as a sketch, which I think is a really fascinating way to think about a kind of record of the past that's also a model for the future, which of course relates to my own thinking. And then I thought, Abril, that connected to your thinking about materiality and the way the RSVP sculptures have the memory of prior interactions. So I kind of just wanted, it's not really a question, but just opening up the idea of documentation and how her works generate documentation in ways that aren't standard, perhaps, or so I just wanted to open up that question.
Yeah, I mean, pertaining to your first question, thinking about Durée, I'm not sure if we got a chance to like fully answer that, but I agree. This like sketch-like quality of the film allows it so that there are so many models of time that are possible. And thinking about looking at artist bodies of work over like decades, I generally try to not flatten them into like arguing that there's continuities where there aren't there. But I think with Nenguti in particular, we see this model of time that is very continuous, and she's been very invested in these same themes as we see in interviews since she was a young child. So I think this idea of Durée and also iterations of performance and sculpture that also are so intimately tied with her relationship to her community, which is unwavering, allows for a model that I don't even think Durée is quite the right name for, but one that I don't fully understand. And then thinking about the performance documentation, or where we've been mostly invested in performance documentation because that's what was shown in Side by Side. But I'm interested to hear this question in relation to sculpture documentation, because there are definitely similarities there as far as like positioning of figures and visual strategies. But in reading them as memories, had like a really difficult time because I think they balance like the deeply personal and spontaneous with also this feeling of removal, which is something we argue in our own paper. But there's also so little of it. Like we continually looked for more images, and I'm interested, Lydia, to hear about your work in the archives, because that's something we really wanted to attend to. But yeah, I think there's a lot to think about there with her performance documentation.
Yeah, I was also going to throw in that I think something Zoe and I were thinking about while writing our paper that we didn't really get a chance to fully like elaborate on, but is the fact that a lot of the original RSVP sculptural performances, especially the one done with Mayer and Hassinger, which like results in those iconic images we have of them both, were performed for the camera. So I think it's also interesting to think about performing for an audience of the future, or an audience which isn't physically present as well, in relationship to the question of performance documentation. And yeah, the notion of temporality, Lydia, that you brought up.
Thank you, Lydia, Zoe, and Michaela. I wanted to ask April if you wouldn't mind expounding more. You talked about, kind of going into more the indigenous your investigations there.
I'm sorry, I lost you for the majority of the question. Could you?
Oh, sorry. I think my internet connection went out. Sorry about that. I wondered if you could expound on the indigenous epistemologies that you explored within Nguti's work, and your discoveries in that area, which I thought was really fascinating.
Well, it was actually quite experimental, if I might say so, because specifically for Andean epistemology, there hasn't been any that I know, at least, applying of this theory to non-Andean artworks. But at the end of the day, there are parts of Andean epistemology that relate to materiality, and that is something that is universal. So I wanted to try that, especially because of this Andean conception of instead of conceiving, for example, a rock or a stone as an entity that can be sort of concealed of its own, what defines this rock is, for example, the pressure that it exerts on the ground, or the pressure that it exerts when it comes across someone's path. So I just found that as a very interesting model to apply to RSVP, because RSVP, I feel like it's defined in its relation first to the performing body, and then to the person who is activating it, or was activating it. Because as I mentioned in my presentation, I feel like there is a lot that is lost in the contemporary museum model of RSVP, where there is no invitation anymore, or actual material invitation. I went in a different path now, but no, I found indigenous epistemology interesting in that sense, because I see RSVP as very difficult to conceive without this pressure or this energy that it brings to the viewer, and the literal material pressure and constraint that it exerts on the performing bodies. So it sort of defines itself through these relations, if that makes sense.
It does. Thank you for that. Fabiola, I wonder if you might, I love how you talked about kind of seeing this as a lens coming from the standpoint as an artist, and how that kind of was an entry point for you. Would you mind expounding on that, and things that kind of inspired you as an artist, as you're looking at her work?
Sure. I think, a lot of it has to do with how I perceive she engages with material, and sort of pushes a material through until the material pushes back. So it's kind of tied to this kind of idea that Avril just discussed, in the sense that, if you work on something long enough, the material itself teaches you its language. And I think that's very much something that Nguti's mastered. But I also think that she comes to materials with a full and very conscientious understanding of how they communicate. It's not just a random or arbitrary choice of something she just, happened to run into or something like that. And I find that, one way that I kind of became enthusiastic about it is that there is a kind of stubborn insistence on continuing through work with the same thing over and over. And I think that's something that is extremely healthy, and not a lot of artists do. Or if you do, it doesn't kind of, if you do it, it's like sometimes comes from a moment of commercialization, whereas I feel like with Nengudi, it came from an earnest impulse to just obsessively handle and rework and work again through these materials. And I think the way that I think about time in her work is sort of like a messianic clock, that kind of procedural way of kind of looking back but moving forward is important here. But I think that, to me, it wasn't just the physical attributes of the materials that was attractive as an artist, but also all the notions that it conjures about how we, produce femininity, or, how we act as feminists in the world, and we can think beyond and because of our maybe ethnic, racial, class, and different backgrounds as such, and how we can sort of within that think of a way in which materials can help us position ourselves in a way that we are happy and content to do so in the world. Yeah, thank you.
I love all of that. It's quite inspiring. Lydia, Voices from the Archives is kind of what comes to mind. What can we, first of all, I'm sure there are many people who would love if, just in this entry point to Nengudi's work, would love to know what archives exist to further investigate her work. And then in your access to these archives, what has that taught you? And, what would you encourage other researchers in the future who are, looking for her in the archives, to look and to seek in that process?
Yeah, definitely. So her archives, based on my understanding, are split between two places. There's the older portion at the Smithsonian in the Archives of American Art in Washington, D.C. And then the more recent portion of her archive, which I believe goes all the way to the 2010s, is at the Amistad Research Center in New Orleans, which houses an incredible repository of African-American historical materials, resources. And I think I spent not long enough, and I've only yet been to DC to look at the kind of earlier set of materials. But one of the things that I was most struck by is that she, so you kind of gain a sense of the artist's personality and parts of them that don't come through the work that gets shown publicly. And I think it was really fascinating to see her shifting relationship to her own work and her shifting relationship to how she documented her work. I think a key thing, like with RSVP, for example, is they don't, the reason that they were kind of dormant until the 2000s is not because they actually fell apart. It's because there was no widespread support for her work, and they weren't maintained. So, and, Nengudi raised a family and had kids and had to, do all these the kind of mundanities that we all do, and her archive is full of that, which is amazing. Her journals are mostly like, call her friend back, mail this gift, and the artistic work kind of glimmers throughout, but it offers a really incredible portrait of her that maybe we don't always get to see. But access in DC is open to researchers. It's an incredible, lovely facility. So I encourage everyone to take a look.
And I believe they also have digital a digital version too, where you can access and request as well. So if you aren't able to go to DC, you can always request a digital copy as well. Thank you for mentioning that, because I'm sure a lot of people were wondering, like, how do I get hands on the archives? Wonderful. So there is a question from the audience, and it's related to Michaela's comment on just now in terms of RSV performances being performed for the camera. Do we know who the photographer behind the camera was? And then do we get into questions of the gaze? Is it a female or male gaze? That's a good question. So in these documentations, do we know who was the behind the camera capturing, and how does that help us to read into, you know, the gaze that we have now and looking back at these historical images? So I don't know, Michaela, since this is in relationship to your comment, do you want to start out with that?
Yeah, absolutely. So Zoe, will you correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the photographer for RSVP in the studio space, the Maren Hossinger and nylon mesh piece, was Clifford Owens, or was it someone else?
That sounds right, but I'll double check while you're talking.
Thank you. It's in our paper. Yes, we do have most of the photographs of Senga and Maren together were taken by a photographer. I believe it was Owens, but it might be someone else. And I think it's interesting to compare that situation, which those photographs were taken in the 70s, with the photographs and documentation that Maren and Senga did for Side by Side, which is specifically done by each other. So in some images, we see Senga being documented by Maren, and then Maren being documented by Senga, and then we also have them in an intimate studio space documented by a standing still camera. So yeah, I don't know if I can speak to gaze necessarily, but I do think it's interesting the inclusion versus exclusion of a third party in terms of their collaboration when you think about it across time, and the ways in which they've incorporated others and then kept it close and vice versa. So yeah.
That's excellent. That was a good question and good answer, Michaela. And then we have another question from the audience. Martinia writes, Herman Outlaw was the photographer at Pearl Woods Gallery in the 1970s. So thank you, Martinia. Any other, I'm trying to see if there's any other questions. Okay. So lots of wonderful areas to explore, I think, with Nguti's work. And I think that the biggest thing that I keep coming back to is, and I think it kind of goes back to with Gabriel, what you mentioned about that resilience and how that translates across, you know, time. And, you know, just, and I think Fabiola, you talked about like that insistence, you know, of, you know, ensuring that you keep doing it, right? There's a very active process there to ensure that your legacy is able to be documented, but also like extends across time. So thinking about, there was a comment made about just her legacy and how she relates so well to younger artists. I would also extend that to say younger curators and younger researchers, that she's a great person to study, because it drives so much, that resiliency, I think, is inspiring. I think Michaela and Zoe, you both referenced that as like you saw yourselves in her collaboration. What would you encourage other researchers like yourselves to consider Because this whole thing, I think, has made me think there should be a Ngudi studies or something. So we were to create a whole theory or a whole field around her work. How could we encourage others to join in? I think that's the question. How would you encourage others to join in like you joined in to this conversation?
I think I really appreciated Michaela and Zoe also working on collaboration, because I think with this very fascinating networks of the 60s and 70s, sometimes researchers might be a bit scared that in working with networks that were born in response to very specific societal conditions, they might be reducting the work to identity concerns. But I think it's very important that we celebrate these networks, even if it's just as human networks. I think that there is this exhibition now about the Just Above Midtown Gallery, and I find that an amazing initiative, because when we move into the future and we realize that there is lots of artists that have not been recognized, I think there is a pitfall of individualizing them to the point that we erase historically these networks. And I think it's very important that we remember how they resisted and how they maintained their creative survival through one another.
Other thoughts? Lydia.
I think I love this. I feel like floating through all of our papers is this notion of her work as a model. We keep using the word model, and I think that is exactly how it is operating. I sometimes like to think of her sculptures as, in as much as they're kind of persistent and recurrent, and they're also like prototypes somehow. They also kind of offer us ways to continue and to build and to respond, even if we can't like physically interact with them. And when Fabiola, Abril, when you were mentioning networks, I couldn't help but think about the way her works have been activated through performance by multiple performers, I think in Denver for her retrospective. And I think there is a kind of Ngudi studies happening, the way that her works are open to physical interaction through dance, and there's a kind of capaciousness to them that I just hope people keep kind of exploring, I suppose.
Can I add to that a little?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I feel like, one reason I feel her work is so relevant to so many people and so attractive is this sort of radical way in which it remains sort of optimist. And again, the notion of resilience, and, maybe the thing theoretically, I know throwing in more theories, maybe not the most productive thing, but I think it is here, thinking of the late Lauren Verlant, and like kind of a beautiful way to think of her practice is a notion of cruel optimism, and how we are kind of soldiering through, even though, the world and climate situation is real, and so many, I think so many, and I think, it's a signal of the fact that things are shifting, and the influence of her ideas is that she won this award, right? But I think that things that I feel for Black people have always been obvious about the world and conditions of attrition in the United States specifically, after 2020 became global concerns that we all, of course, should have been and ought to be and remain aware of. So I think at the core of her project is a way of living that is a politic, rather than, I think it was Dave Hammons or something, and I'm sure you've all read this because, it's in all of the literatures, is the idea that, she wasn't included in a lot of exhibitions because she wasn't perceived as making work about Blackness. But I think the core of her project is this kind of radical approach to just remaining optimistic. And I think that's what the main takeaway was for me as an artist, but also just as a researcher. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Is it okay if I?
Yes. Go ahead, Zoe.
Thank you. Yeah, just to like kind of close up your question, Dr. Cross, about how we keep this work going. I think it's exactly efforts like these on behalf of the Nasher, and then also shows like Topologies, where we have so many people writing about her work that we're really going to come to these conclusions, because not many of us talked beforehand, and we all come to the same conclusion, Lydia, as you said, of her work is this model or framework that we can each fill in ways that work for our inquiries. But I think it's predominantly about extending generosity and care and the labor that is scholarship that is so immediately fruitful with her work.
Yeah, I was just gonna add on to that briefly and say, yeah, I think it's coming together in part in spaces like this in which we like recognize and acknowledge each other's work, not in a necessarily utopic sensibility, just as Nengudi doesn't talk about her collaborations as such, but rather acknowledging the tensions and difficulties it is in agreeing and disagreeing upon these historical issues and coming together in forums like this. So, yeah.
Beautiful. I think there is one last question and a comment, kind of going back to that question about who was documenting. Martina also mentioned that they had a shared photographer whose name was Adam Avila, who photographed both Ngudi's and Hasinger's work a lot, and they met this particular photographer at LACMA. So just for those wondering, that's great information. Thank you, Martina, for sharing that. And then for Fabiola, Leigh says that we at the Nasher were all fascinated by the connections you were making between such desperate subjects as a tornado, Twister, and Ngudi's RSVP series. The commonality being the nylon stocking. Could you speak to how you came to bringing those two ideas together, which is a great question.
Yeah, thank you. I came to that because of studying The Wizard of Oz and sort of learning that it was made of cloth. You know, that kind of blew me away. The idea that something that seems so forceful and so resilient and all-absorbing, that similarly pulls everything that's outside and brings it into a central kind of eye. And then seeing that image in Ngudi's work just fascinated me. I was like, you know, I feel like you could write an entire dissertation of tornadoes in art. but I just felt like, sorry, there's public space here. I felt like the tornado is just such a strong image to think about things like diaspora or leaving and returning. And The Wizard of Oz really provides that framework. And I also found it kind of poetically relevant to my ongoing research that it happens to be one of the earliest examples of like feminist film that we have, that we can take away of. And also that is, you know, the birth of special effects, because I think in many ways, Ngudi's work is also a special effect. It can create this moments of, you know, where depending on where you are in relation to the sculpture, you give it a certain reading around things of gender and race, or maybe sexuality even. So, you know, it forces the viewer into a relationship that I feel The Wizard of Oz also did. Yeah. It's a good way to thinking about the formations of personhood.
That's awesome. Oh, so lastly, I wanted to plug the Compendium, which is going to be published March 31st of 2023, in time for the release party on that day. And that's kind of a culmination of all of what has been presented this week in celebration of Ngudi's work. And then there was one last question by Andrea Tostan, who I know is an awesome, fabulous artist in Dallas, who asked where we can access each of your writings. And so we know that there are recordings of your papers, but for those who are interested in your writings, that will be published in that release in March. So exciting things to come, and more celebrations to come at the end of the spring for the Nasher Prize. I think we're really at the end of our time together. Thank you to all of our panelists for your wonderful research and presentations and for this conversation. I really have enjoyed each and everything that you all have mentioned. And I hope that everyone else watching and tuning in also enjoyed as well. We will take a brief intermission, and then we'll come back and hear from our keynote, our wonderful keynote, Dr. Kellie Jones. But thank you, everyone, for tuning in today and being so engaging. And we hope to see you back in a little bit. Welcome, everyone, to the 2023 Nasher Prize Conversations Graduate Symposium. We're I know I'm very full and excited about the wonderful presentations that we had the opportunity to see this week in celebration of 2023 Nasher Prize laureate Singa Ngugi. I'm Dr. Lauren Cross, your moderator, and today we will be ending our symposium with a wonderful keynote by the wonderful Dr. Kellie Jones. And so I want to give this opportunity to introduce her. Dr. Kellie Jones is the Hans Hofmann Professor of Modern Art and Chair of African American and African Diaspora Studies at Columbia University. Her research interests include African American and African diaspora artists, Latinx and Latin American artists, and issues in contemporary art and museum theory. Dr. Jones has received numerous awards for her work from the Hutchinson Center for African and African American Research at Harvard University, Creative Capital's Warhol Foundation Arts Writers Grant, and a term as scholar in residence at the Terra Foundation for American Art in France. In 2016, she was named a MacArthur Foundation Fellow, and her writings have appeared in a multitude of exhibition catalogs and journals. She is the author of 2 published books by Duke University Press. One of my favorites is I Minded, which was published in 2011, and South of Pico, African American artist in Los Angeles in the 1960s and 1970s, which was named a Best Art Book of 2017. She has worked as a curator for over 3 decades and has numerous major national and international exhibitions to her credit. Her exhibition, Now Dig This, Art in Black Los Angeles, 1960 to 1980, at the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles, was named one of the best exhibitions of 2011 and 2012 by Art Forum, and best thematic show nationally by the International Association of Art Critics. I'm so very honored to have her in our presence to talk about the work of Singa Ngugi. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Kellie Jones.
Thank you so much. It's so wonderful to be here today, and thank you to the Nasher Sculpture Center for the lovely invitation. I've enjoyed listening to the week's presentations, Fabiola Carranza's insight on elasticity and the history of nylon, Lydia Ferreira's work, Troubling the Standing Categories of Conceptual Practice, Abril Ramirez's thoughts on resilience and sculptural relations, Michaela Gray and Zoe Roden's commitment to presenting a talk that inscribed co-creating and collaborating, and the adept shepherding of all by Lauren Cross. Certainly, Ngugi studies and art history are in good hands. Also, thanks goes to the Sculpture Prize jury, Catherine Kraft, curator. It's always a pleasure to be in dialogue with her. Leigh Arnold, associate curator for her logistics. Lindsay James for navigating the virtual space. And always to Singa Ngugi for the decades of dialogues, willingness to collaborate, archival predilections, beautiful spirit, and amazing art practice. Always an honor and pleasure to work with Senga. I speak to you today from the ancestral and unceded territory of the Lenape people, a place of longstanding importance to Native people from the region and around the world. We honor Indigenous people of this place and their legacy and recognize their displacement, dispossession, and continued presence. Can I have the first slide, please? In opening up discussions on the work of Senga Ngugi, I want to focus further on the context of the 1970s through the lens of Black feminisms of the era and conversations surrounding the African diaspora, global Blackness, aesthetics, and liberation. Today, I'll be thinking primarily with three scholars, Jafari Allen, Brittany Cooper, and Shatima Threadcraft, to further expand my considerations of Black feminism and the African diaspora in this era, and muse on Ngugi's work as indeed its own theorization of what still captivates me as an incredible time. In his recent book, There's a Disco Ball Between Us, A Theory of Black Gay Life, Jafari Allen, a professor of anthropology, African diaspora studies, and queer studies, sets the stage for 21st century theorizations by taking us back to the 1970s, or what he terms the long 80s, and the work of Black feminists who did not fit as easily into the largely white middle-class rubric of second wave feminism. He reads Black feminisms of the time as more complex and intersectional, that went beyond dichotomous thinking, and in its radical valence, rebuking gender inequity and heterosexism, and indeed calling for the eradication of all forms of domination and elitism. Can I have the next slide, please? These included figures like poet Audre Lorde, activist Pat Parker, and the Combahee River Collective. Even singer Abby Lincoln contributed to such conversations with her essay, Who Will Revere the Black Woman?, which first appeared in 1966. These women were part of what he terms the anthological generation, whose compiled writings presented not a single, but a grouping of voices that insisted on language, theory, and action as a collective endeavor, with myriad ideas coming together as a whole. As Professor Allen notes, quote, to be anthologized is to be called and culled together under one cover, end quote. And in the case of 1970s Black feminisms, toward an aim of self-definition and world liberation. Brittany Cooper's Beyond Respectability, the Intellectual Thought of Race Women, covers what we might consider the long 20th century of Black feminist activism, Black feminist activist and intellectual work, beginning in the 19th century with the writings of race women inspired by the National Association of Colored Women, or the Club movement. Primarily using the format of memoir, they wrote themselves into our political and intellectual histories. By the 1970s, Professor Cooper also sees a turn towards anthological practice, with literary and creative work of the era serving as theory. For Black women, intellectual work was public work as opposed to academic treaties that brought together women of all walks of life to speak about Black liberation through the anthologized structure, and in doing so, pushed back against the notion that experts were all men. In this act of expansive listing, Cooper tells us, women call names in order to, quote, construct their own intellectual and political genealogy, end quote. Next slide, please. Toni Cade Bambara's The Black Woman, 1970, is one of the first anthologies of this period, followed by others, including This Bridge Called My Back, writings by radical women of color in 1981, and Homegirls, a Black feminist anthology of 1983. It is the era that saw the rise of writers such as Alice Walker, Toni Morrison, Maya Angelou, Ntozake Shange, and the visibility of Angela Davis on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list. Cooper also singles out community-based spaces as Black female counterpublic space, spaces to contest official dominant narratives as an important aspect of the 1970s Black feminist time. This would certainly apply to the organizing and anthologizing Black women artists were up to, and in which Sengen Ngugi played a significant role. This included the 1970 Sapphire Show, possibly the first exhibition of all Black women, held in Los Angeles at Suzanne Jackson's Gallery 32, and Ngugi's collective work with Studio Z, Other Vision Studio. Next slide, please. And the decades-long creative partnership with Maren Hassinger. Samela Lewis's organizational energy on the West Coast can be counted as another Black feminist coalescing force by way of her numerous galleries, exhibitions, and publishing projects. Through these iterations of community, Sengen Ngugi and others formulated new ideas of a Black public. They challenged masculinist narratives, pushing against narrow notions of gender, Blackness, theory, and sociality. Similarly, in New York, we can look to the organization and exhibition in 1971 of Where We At Black Women Artists, co-founded by Faith Ringgold. Then there was Just Above Midtown Gallery, or JAM, helmed by Ohio native Linda Good Bryant, creating a space that emerged on New York's elite Gallery Row in 1974, then blazing a path in the up-and-coming art districts of Tribeca and Soho. This was another coalescing of Black feminist vitality, one that both physically and intellectually constructed the place with assistance from the likes of Lowry Stokes Sims, Lorraine O'Grady, Fred Wilson, and many others. Ngugi first appeared in JAM's all-women show, In Recognition, put together by Good Bryant to mark the US bicentennial and celebrate, quote, the energy and creative genius of all women, end quote. Yet, as the gallerist continued, quote, as in other areas of our society, the American female, particularly the Black American female, has not been given her just recognition. Opening in December 1976, In Recognition featured an expansive national but also global roster. Suzanne Jackson, Sengen Ngugi, and Betty Sarr from Los Angeles. Barbara Chase Rabeau sent things from Europe, and Valerie Maynard and Howardina Pindell were among those who represented New York. Ngugi debuted her sprawling nylon mesh and sand installation, Swing Shift, 1976, a prelude to her groundbreaking solo show of such objects, RSVP, in 1977 at JAM. Next slide, please. However, it is not only these amazing Black feminist networks that had a key part in forming that Ngugi had a key part in forming in the 1970s, but the appearance and materiality of the work itself that outlined aesthetics in conversation with the thinking of Black women and feminists in this era, particularly as it engaged women's realities and presence. Two statements illuminate the ways in which the artist conceived of the place of the body in her work, beginning in the 1970s, intersecting with Black feminist rubrics. And these are statements that we've heard a lot about this week. We've heard them over and over again, so I will repeat them one more time here. Statement number 1, I am working with nylon mesh because it relates to the elasticity of the human body, from tender tight beginnings to sagging end. The body can only stand so much push and pull until it gives way, never to resume its original shape. After giving birth to my own son, I thought of Black wet nurses suckling child after child, their own as well as those of others, until their breasts rested on their knees, their energies drained. My works are abstracted reflections of used bodies, visual images that serve my aesthetic decisions, as well as my ideas. And that's from the late 70s. Statement number 2. I have fought the joy of creating impermanent objects most of my life. An artist's supposed greatest desire is the making of objects that will last lifetimes, after all. This has never been a priority for me. My purpose is to create an experience that will vibrate with the connecting thread. And that's from 1995. In the first statement, Nangudi quite conclusively references the Black female body with the mention of the wet nurse, an image which brings us back to the period of slavery. Here, the artist's thoughts intersect with what Brittany Cooper thinks of as embodied discourse, the ways in which Black women intellectuals, artists, and activists over the long 20th century centered the knowledge of their own bodies, moving through and experiencing space and the world as the basis of social thought. Professor Cooper cites Anna Julia Cooper's 19th century positing of anxiousness or anxiety about their lives' futures as both a negative feeling, but also one that spurred these women's activism, and in doing so, fueled humanity's movement forward. Mary Church Terrell's love of the bodily pleasures of dancing and Anna Arnold Hedgeman's physical witnessing of the 1963 March on Washington, and specifically its organizers' suppression of female voices, were exemplary of the bodily sense these women experienced and deployed to drive their activism. The fact that Nangudi insisted that her materials must be used and not brand new is significant. Such things under her care continue their role in embodiment, just as Anna Julia Cooper, Hedgeman, and Terrell pour the sense of their own lives into their written work. In the second statement, Nangudi, some 20 years after the first, she reveals how her own ambivalence, or in Cooper's framing, anxiousness, about creating permanent objects has always led her back to human interaction. Compelled by corporeality and the kinesthesia of the body, it is the pleasure and excitement of performance and dance that Nangudi has cultivated for decades. This is an ephemeral and non-object, but one that creates experiences which connect people. However, her sculptural objects have always evinced this sense of bodily relations, though in a very, very abstracted sense. The water compositions of the 1960s were set in motion by human proximity, if not direct engagement. We might also think of their watery innards encased in a vinyl skin as glossing human corporeality that is composed somewhere upwards of 90% water. Next slide, please. While living in New York in the early 1970s, Nangudi turned to fabric. The pieces were flat, some silhouettes approximating humanoid figures, but suspended in space, many outdoors activated by the wind. Fabric was another type of skin to approximate the sensory apparatus of the body, a haptic sensuality and freedom. Arriving at the nylon mesh constructions enabled Nangudi to further engage the notion of embodied female knowledge or common senses, its mass, volume, its tensions, and movement through space. And in collaborations with Maren Hassinger, in particular, its entanglements. Next slide, please. The titles and what they appear to impugn on some of the earlier works in this style, for example, Insides Out, Internal, Sagging, Winter, Inside, Outside, suggest inherent meanings linked to Black feminist discourse of the moment, but also over time. The writing of political theorist Shatima Threadcraft in her book, Intimate Justice, The Black Female Body and the Body Politic, indicates how Nenguti's work too perhaps engaged in its own subtle form of visual activism. Threadcraft elucidates the ways in which the Black female body and feminine labors, quote, have been constrained and diminished within the American body politic, end quote, and subjected to disproportionate violence based in a racial inequality that is distinctly gendered. These include brutal practices of coerced reproduction and enforced child neglect in the period of enslavement that transmogrifies into later sterilization abuse in the 20th century. Threadcraft highlights sexual violence as a weapon, part of practices of racial terror and domination, and the ways in which, quote, the Black female body in particular existed to meet the physical, emotional, and sexual needs of the white body, end quote. Such American histories assume then a Black feminist activism that is historical, not newly born, but raised in struggles for equality, for the free use of their own bodies and imaginations, and rights to health and integrity in the political and material environment. This Threadcraft nominates as the pursuit of intimate justice. While Nenguti's propositions in materials, in space, and with context includes a direct and more easily recognizable approach to representation, her work certainly orbits the bodily. And it is actually in a long line of Black artists whose thoughts on embodiment inflected their making as well. Earlier in the 20th century, and of course prior to that, legal segregation barred African-American artists from life drawing classes, which required them to focus on a nude white body, usually of a woman. How were they to understand the workings of the human form given these strictures to such classical training? Nancy Elizabeth Prophet and Richmond Barté became their own best models. This resulted in sculpture in which gender cues shifted and swerved, opening up to an invented transgender aesthetics, especially for these Harlem Renaissance era artists. Next slide, please. At mid-century, in light of such legal covenants, Elizabeth Catlett's teacher encouraged her to imagine how the sculptural poses would feel if she herself were holding them. This endeavor was naturalized by Catlett's own athleticism as a swimmer. Of course, the iterations of Nenguti's aesthetic were not only American in their references or inspiration. She had already spent a year in Japan in the 1960s. She had brought her version of post-minimalism to Europe in the exhibition Huit Artistes Afro-Américains at the Musée Rath in Geneva, Switzerland in 1971, the first major exhibition of its kind, including very visible figures like Romare Bearden and Bob Thompson. However, in the era of Black power and the Black arts movement, Nenguti's turn towards Africa and its diasporas was hard to deny. As she reminded us retrospectively about the sighting of her signature performance, Ceremony for Freeway Fets in 1978. And please go to the next slide. Quote, "For me, it had the feel of what I imagined an African village to be." And as her collaborator, Maren Hassinger, noted, as I look back on it, there is something incredibly African about it. If you have seen a kind of traditional performance, there might be some talking, then there might be this burst of insane energy. And that's what that twirling around was for me. It was this burst of insane from nowhere kind of energy. I associate that kind of timing, that kind of surprise punch with African theatrical tradition. Nenguti's performative Africa and the Americas had everything to do with performance aesthetics of largely West and Central African masquerades in their materiality, but also their sense of sociality and spirituality. Her rubrics were created in conversation with exhibitions in Los Angeles and African descendant spiritual traditions that she had encountered in Latinx and Black precincts of New York. Those shared by her friend, artist Charles Abramson, and others such as Ademola Olujibifola and the Weusi Collective, or the exhibitionary culture at the Studio Museum in Harlem. Next slide, please. This sense of ritual is also understood in different ways in assemblages by Betty Saar in the short film Water Ritual Number 1, An Urban Rite of Purification of 1979 by Barbara McCullough. These were not simply forms of entertainment, but systems that codified experience, art as a platform for and staging of ideals as a guide. They aligned with African traditions where masquerade could be a thoroughfare between the world of the living and ancestral realms, understood also in the installations and performances by Houston Conwell. And as Zia Strother reminds us, such presentations served as sites of contact, places where one might acknowledge and embrace, quote, the invisible family members dancing alongside, end quote. One of my favorite quotes ever. We want to consider also how such 1970s art projects by Ngugi and others read not only in the context of advancing African independence, but in the reconsiderations of the parameters of citizenship in the context of US bicentennial celebrations and the Vietnam War and other battles of a domestic nature that demonstrated the continuing precarity of Black life. Some sites of understanding diaspora that Ngugi would have encountered were decidedly feminist. The very first issue of Samela Lewis's periodical Black Art and International Quarterly of 1976 had articles on the African influence on Black American art, as well as Afro-Brazilian creativity. Linda Good Bryant's Just Above Midtown Gallery project was decidedly diasporic from its beginnings. And think about Ngugi as part of AIR Gallery's Dialectics of Isolation exhibition, organized by Anna Mendieta, Kazuko Miyamoto, and Zarina in 1980, in which the curators named and aligned themselves with life worlds of third world women around the globe. Such framings point again to Cooper's embodied discourse in the work of 1970s Black feminism that was also solidly transnational in its commitment to anti-war activism and global solidarity, which saw itself as part of a larger gathering of third world women and a support to self-determination for the oppressed worldwide. Next slide, please. Photographer Marilyn Nance's recent book, Last Day in Lagos, perhaps most evinces the palpable enthusiasm with such diasporic dialogues in the 1970s. Nance's book revolves around her attendance at Festac, the Second World Black and African Festival of Arts and Culture. The month-long Pan-African Festival held at the start of 1977 in Lagos, Nigeria. Through her voluminous photographic archive and accompanying narration, Nance's excitement with her journey and encounters with a diasporic global family is unmistakable. Her images hold stories of interactions, connections, and intimacies. They also reveal a Pan-African sisterhood, particularly as she recalls the details of she and her friend Ajuba Douglas traveling as photo and film technicians to the continent and the ways in which their insistent Black feminist collaboration and self-possession made their participation possible. Nance's account, her own art and that of others, turns on the romanticism of a singular global Black solidarity. Even so, the 1970s also presents a fascinating moment to speak about the relationship of African and African-American art and issues of appropriation, authenticity, as well as diaspora. Artists like Ngugi could be taken to task for their use of symbolism linked to Africa and its apparent misapplication or misuse outside of traditional contexts. In this scenario, African-American artists are seen as substituting African methods for their own, i.e. white and Western and someone else's logic. However, if we look at literature on African art making in the 20th century, we find that modern African artists were going through similar motions. As art historian Salah Hassan has written about, quote, the nationalistic and cultural resurgence that swept many newly independent African countries, where government patronage and interest in the arts became part of the building, and in some cases, inventing of a national culture and identity. The basic quest of these new movements and initiatives was to establish a more culturally rooted, self-conscious, and African aesthetic expression, end quote. Modern African art was part of the movement toward envisioning and creating a post-colonial identity that reflected Africa's encounter with Europe and its creative traditions, while at the same time seeking out characteristics of African form that had been discredited by the logic of colonialism. In envisioning a new modern culture, African artists had to create something that acknowledged both their heritage and their Western training and knowledge. African art was not a monolithic entity, but at the very least was comprised of traditional approaches and other practices marked by Western training acquired either in workshops or schools in Africa or in the metropole itself. This latter group then, though certainly having a different relationship to African tradition, nevertheless approached it in much the same way African Americans such as Ngugi and others did in the 1970s. Reconnecting with a heritage that had been severed as a way to explore and honor roots and add vitality to their own practice with rediscovered wellsprings of creative imagination. Next slide, please. African and African-American artists, along with those of African descent in Europe, the Caribbean, and other locales, became part of the global dialogue around art. Scholars Olu Agwibe and Mantia Diawara have discussed how the urban settings of Lagos, Nigeria, and Bamako, Mali, respectively, were energized by Black cultures of the African diaspora during this period. With the dawning of independence in African countries, got a little ahead of myself. Youth saw in diasporic cultures reflections of their own freedom. In style, music, and visual images, they created a new habitus of liberated Black bodies, globally united by Black pride, civil rights, and self-determination. That was part of global and diasporic conversations. For instance, in Mali, photographer Malik Sidibe encountered his subjects in the streets and youth clubs of Bamako, assembling a post-colonial present. The style and self-possession in these images in conversation with an international Pan-African and diasporic life that circulated in filmic, musical, and print culture. The Nigerian superstar Fela Kuti was classically trained in London and initially turned to American jazz. During the Biafran War, he self-exiled to New York City from 1969 to 1970, and there, under the sway of Black Power and the Black Arts Movement, began rethinking his relationship to African culture. In the diaspora, he turned to African dress and embraced a spiritual and musical change, which led to his development of the Afrobeat sound and the birth of his band, Africa 70. Indeed, Kuti's time in New York may have overlapped with Ngugi's, which further illuminates her own evolution in this rich stew of African diasporic cultural and aesthetic formation. As historian Tanisha Ford notes, the beauty and aesthetics of the era also embodied its political power. Ford refers to this as soul style, global Black fashion, and an approach to the bodily that began as youthful underground practices. Clothes were deployed as a social skin, signaling the ways in which one chose to appear before the world. I want to think about the talismanic qualities Ford ascribes to clothes and fabric, the way they are fashioned to protect and care for the self. Their sensuality and vitality amplifies that of the body itself. How similar haptics and tactility of textiles is used in the service of the sensate in works by Sengen Ngudi from the 1970s. If Ngudi also uses fabric to suggest a social skin in the 70s, it is one seemingly disassembled from recognizable representational strategies. Yet it is still engaged through performance, ritual, and contextually and materially to a global Blackness and diasporic histories. Such diasporic yearning is communicated not only through the sensation of fabric, but the signifying strategies invested in the weight and texture of sand in her objects. If sand signals the environmental and place, it is deconstructed and dispersed, gesturing in ways to the desire for an ancestral or safe home in the context of global Black familial diasporic space heralded by a gathering like Festag. While science certainly signifies place, its granular nature also gives it a referential property through its ability to cling to and thus trace bodies. And in the words of scholar Vanessa Agar Jones, quote, "The sands remember." Next slide, please. While shape, line, volume, and aspects of transparency are the major constitutive elements that frame our understanding of what we see in Ngudi's now canonical works from the 70s, there is color too. The sculptures pro-offer browns and tans, an array of flesh tones, and a delicate subtleness by which other hues surface. The unrelenting gesturing and gathering of their outstretched forms evokes Jose Esteban Muñoz's concept of the brown commons. He conceives of this as a, quote, vast and pulsating social world, end quote, collective and common, held jointly and mundane, birthed from liberatory histories. It represents, quote, a kind of uncanny persistence in the face of distressed conditions of possibility, end quote. Equally, we can turn to the continual reappearance of an oceanic blue shade across Ngudi's entire oeuvre from the water compositions onwards. Such chroma intimates shifting dynamics between land and sea that calls forth a diasporic conjuncture, disassembled and contextual. Like Yoruba Gelede masquerades that employ layers of women's head ties or baby wrappers to inscribe feminist bearing and power, we can imagine similar understandings in the contours of Sengen Ngudi's nylon mesh. Reminders that in ways honor Threadcraft's call for intimate justice or Cooper's paradigms of embodied discourse. Yet after theorists Hortense Spillers and Rizvana Bradley, Ngudi's pieces also bring us to a place ungendered, corporeal form as flesh. Thinking with film scholar Kara Keeling, we can understand Ngudi's approach as one which is pre-gendered, the argument Keeling makes for the iconic activist citizen subject of the 70s. Through the lens of transgender method, Sengen Ngudi expansively reimagines accepted subjectivities, shifting our vision towards more capacious human configurations. Next slide, please. I want to close with a reconsideration of her signature performance, Ceremony for Freeway Fetes. Here she presents a détente between opposing genders. David Hammons represented male energy and Maren Hassinger female power, with Ngudi herself as a resulting third state of harmonious possibility. I end here with a quote from Omasake Natasha Tinsley on racial capitalism's middle passage as an engine of diasporic conjuncture and queer, trans, and militant formations. Queer, not in the sense of a gay or same-sex loving identity waiting to be excavated from the ocean floor, but as a praxis of resistance. Queer in the sense of making disruption to the violence of normative order, and powerfully so. Connecting in ways that commodified flesh was never supposed to. Loving your own kind when your kind was supposed to cease to exist. Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jones. I think my video, there you go. Thank you so much, Dr. Jones. That was amazing. I was over here writing so many notes. So at this time, I think that we're going to open it up for questions from the audience, questions from our fellow panelists. But I'll start off with a couple of questions while we're waiting. So I was definitely enjoying the collective scholarship of Black feminism within your presentation. So I wonder if you could expound on how important that is to contextualize Nguti's work within that realm of scholarship. And you said so many things too. So.
Yeah, well, I think it's just one avenue. I think what we've seen this week is there are many ways that we can think about it that are equally valid. There's not one way to see an artwork, you know, literally in Nguti's case, but also I think, you know, the more the merrier. I'm just, you know, was very captivated by reading these somewhat recent texts and thinking about, you know, the kind of the durée, as people have been talking about, the long idea of how Black women have been, you know, there's this idea that, you know, there's feminism and womanism and, you know, Black women really weren't into feminism in the 70s. Well, but they were doing the work for many years. And that, I think that's what we want to think about. I wanted to think about that history of, you know, certainly how Black creators and intellectuals who were women, their struggles, but also how they invented themselves, how they got their work out there, and how Nguti could fit into this kind of longer trajectory. It's part of a project I've been working on also to think about women's work for the last few years, and, you know, really thinking about this idea of what would art history look like if it was narrated through the lives, work, and ideas of women. So, and feminists, and I think also moving also into trans and queer theory in a larger degree to really think about the interstices and the kind of areas that become unclear in some of these histories, particularly in my work on earlier artists like Nancy Elizabeth Prophet, Barté, Gusta Savage, where people look at their work and they say, wow, this work is really like not hip. You know, this is not modern. So you've got to bring another kind of lens to it and then really try to get into what was going on. Leads me to another point, which is Senga Nguti's archival impulse. I mean, she saves absolutely everything, and we are better for it. But in some of these earlier archives for Black artists in the early 20th century, these works are orphaned, you know. There is no estate, there is no archive, there is, you know, you really have to do a lot of digging and, you know, thinking about Saidiya Hartman's idea of critical fabulation. You really have to look at these, what you do have, and really think and come up with theories that for you explain what's going on or what went on. And for me, I always lean into the history of what was going on for Black people in these moments, because, you know, we have to remember segregation was real and that Black artists didn't have access to, museums in the same way, depending on where they lived. So, and artwork. So it's really, for me, it's exciting to think about her in that kind of longer history right now.
Such a powerful and I think important, historically, to understand those cultural nuances that exist within an artist's life. Because I think sometimes, we don't always see that an artist has a life outside of being an artist, and how that is that they're bridging that for us. And so having that context is so important. Zoe Roden has a question for you, Dr. Jones. So I'm going to extend the mic to her so she can ask you a question.
Fantastic.
Hi, yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Jones, for that really illuminating presentation. I was so struck about your observations about the feminist sensibility of Nguti's work. I'm wondering if you might expand a little bit about this presentation in relation to the collective investment of gender deconstruction that was going on in and around Studio Z. Specifically, I'm really interested in Nguti's collaborations with Franklin Parker, Ulysses Jenkins, and Maren Hossinger on performances like Dance Card and Flying. Against the backdrop of the women's liberation movement, I find their close working relationship with Parker and Jenkins on themes of feminism and domesticity both unique and really energizing.
Thank you for that, Zoe. I think this is part of that same, moment where she's really, she's digging into gender and she's insisting on certain kinds of relations in some way. She's, these are her performances. She's driving it as much as it is a collaboration and her openness to working. But I think I think you can see this with, as people talk about in the 70s with Black feminists, that there's still a relationship to Black liberation movements, right? Because second wave feminism is not the same type of feminism that that Black women are talking about for the most part. And there's a lot written on that, which I won't go into, but the books that I mentioned will illuminate it all. But I think, you really see her working in that same way. This is why I'm thinking of it as a theorization of the time. As we think about the kind of anthological generation that Allen and Cooper talk about, right? That how she works with these artists, these other artists, and insists on the collaboration with her works. If you even think about, if we can transpose our thinking to thinking about music and like say jazz combos, for instance, it's such a male space, right, where women who are in there and mostly are singers, and the kind of difficulties of kind of, leading a band in some way. You have to really be strong in certain ways because it's such a male space. I think what performance opens up for her in this case is something that is much more mobile and flexible in terms of gender relations. And again, it's about how we want to frame that as writers, as art historians, as theorists, and really look at that. And what's also great is all the work that people have been doing with these artists. Stephanie Weber's, of course, great topologies with Senga, with so much work in there. Ulysses Jenkins' project, right? That has been curated by Meg Onley and Erin Christoval, right? Which is another fabulous book. In fact, 2 books were published as part of that solo exhibition project that is, I think, going also to Germany, was in Philadelphia, was also at the Hammer. So I think with more research, it opens up these kind of trajectories. Again, if we think about Ulysses Jenkins, his work also on, really looking at masculinity, Black masculinity, you can see how, the conversation that they had at that time with these issues around gender and sexuality. So I think this is something that needs to be followed through on even more. I mean, I know I'm just scratching the surface, and certainly Meg Only and Erin Christoval have done work on this with Ulysses Jenkins, but there's always need for more.
Absolutely. Amen to that. I've enjoyed everything. I've enjoyed your presentation, Dr. Jones. And I don't know if there's any other questions out there lingering, holding out for those who are formulating their questions. But I greatly appreciate all of the rich theories that you brought together in your presentation, from the transnational to the queer theory to, just everything, and expanding it in so many different ways. And I think, like you said earlier, that there's not one way. And so I appreciate that interdisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity, really, in which you influenced in your presentation. So that's greatly appreciated. Well, I don't know if there's any final questions, but Dr. Jones, is there any final thoughts that you would like to share with our viewing audience before we go?
Well, I just want to thank the Nasher again for this great opportunity to listen to new work. And it's great to be able to have this forum to listen to new work in art history by younger scholars, and just fabulous that Senga Ngugi has been chosen to be, the laureate, or to be the prize winner. And so I think those are, it's evidence of her own importance, as we've talked about today, just how this work continues to impact, and luckily she's still with us. I mean, that's one of the things, like my own work turning more to women, because you see, people having their first museum survey at 100 years old. We can't do that anymore. So we need to start celebrating these people and the amazing work that they did, and do and I think this is definitely one form for it. I'll go back, because I did take some notes. I'll say one more thing, which is going back to something that Brielle said about, how we don't see that interaction anymore, certainly with the RSVP series. But if you go to any of Senga's performances, there is an interactive element in it. So be careful what you wish for, because you may not, if you're like me, you're like, whoo, I don't know if I want to be involved with some of these interactions. But I think Sengas are usually very, very easy on people. But there is always an interaction. And we can see that with people like Maren Hassinger, Linda Good-Bryant. If you see a public presentation or a performance of their work, there is still an interactive engagement. So that has not gone away. I think it's gone away certainly with RSVP, because we want to think about the precarity of the materials. And, just to mention one more thing, which is, when I was organizing Now Dig This, and I approached, she and Maren Hassinger about being in it, and they were like, well, we're going to have to do some other things, because Senga was like, where do I have these? They're gone. So that was, she had already, as has been noted, done some reconstructions in early in this century. But to be able to continue to do that and to get back into that. And I think Maren Hassinger had another problem. It was an opposite problem, which is, how long are you going to drag these giant pieces of metal around from those early works from the 70s? So, there was an idea that these things didn't exist, certainly because, I think for the most part, because of lack of interest in the work by African-American artists, Black women. But I'm glad that this prize is changing that, and that our world and scholarship, like the scholarship we've heard all week, is changing that. So I'm very thankful.
I'm thankful as well. I think Lydia had one question, so I want to let her have a chance to ask you something.
Thank you, Dr. Cross. And thank you, Dr. Jones, for that remarkable paper. I had a question kind of going back to your note earlier in the talk about questions of appropriation of African visual culture, African material culture in ceremony for freeway fetes in particular. And I wondered if you think or could comment on whether, because at that point, Nangudi was likely, and maybe you can correct me here, engaging with those forms through literature and then maybe in museums, like presentations of African or West African visual culture in museum settings, where those objects are often historically have been, stripped of their contexts, detemporalized. And I wonder if we can think about her engagement with that, some of those forms in relation to the museum or exhibitionary world in which African visual culture may have made its way into Nangudi's life at that point. Hoping that makes sense and wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Of course. Thank you for that. Absolutely. I mean, in Los Angeles, you had the Fowler, I think it's Institute, which has been around since the 50s. The study of African art is revolutionizing in the 60s and the 70s. And what is revolutionary about it is that the idea that Western scholars have held, or collectors, is that in the early part of the 20th century, most African art was stripped of all the non-wooden things, right? So the fabric, the beads, the such and such. And certainly in terms of masquerade, which is, I think, for Nangudi, the kind of most very focused interest, scholars like Robert Ferris Thompson and John Ross were in LA saying, no, the mask is the carapace. Masking is the whole costume, and masquerade is the whole idea of performance. And so that is beginning to be shown, taught. One of the things that's important about, the number of shows that Robert Ferris Thompson did in LA at the Fowler is that they had video, right? And so we're thinking about this in the 70s, the video, the film that's been transposed. So this is a different way of understanding what African art is, right, from previous times. And we also want to think about how African art itself was considered anthropological, right? So it's also at this time that it moves into the study of these objects, move into more solidly into art history as a discipline, right? So I think all of those shifts between the 60s and 70s are impacting what she's seeing, certainly in LA. Now, when you go to New York, when you spend 4 years in New York and you're hanging around with people who are practicing African descended religions like Santeria and so on, and you're up in Harlem, and it's not only, she's living in El Barrio, right? El Barrio is, we want to think about these African descended religions coming to the Caribbean in places like Puerto Rico and Cuba. And we want to think about here again, the Puerto Rican migration to New York, starting, say, in the 40s or so. And these kind of major communities, you want to think about the music you're hearing. The music you're hearing in El Barrio is very much part of an African tradition, a diasporic tradition. So yes, it's Africa, but it's inflected in these many, many ways, right? As I pointed out, it is, that's what diaspora is, right? You see Africa through these different valences in another location. And then also, if we want to think about people like Fela Kuti, who's an African who's coming to New York, and experiencing what he's experiencing and bringing his culture as he knows it. And we can also throw in somebody else who's there at the same time in New York is Elio Otisika, right? We want to think about his relationship to African descended aesthetics through a Brazilian context, and his own parangoles as well, a kind of masquerade form. So, we want to think about how all this comes in. I think if, people will see the work here, the ceremony for Freeway Fets, her changing of her name, people will say, oh my God, these are people who are appropriating African culture. But I think it's more complex than that. And I think appropriation is a word that's more freely thrown around now as, being something so scary and problematic. And there are problematic edges to it. But I think we really have to dig in and see what the interactions are. What are the collaborations? What are the relations? As all of you all have been talking about in these cases. So that's where I stand with that.
Very beautiful. Realized I was muting that point. Thank you, Dr. Jones. That was magnificent explanation of that. Well, I think we are at the end of our program. Thank you all for tuning in with us again and our final day. I want to say a big thank you to Dr. Jones and your awesome presentation, and for just, weaving all of these, different nuances and theories and frameworks for us to consider, and for your generosity, intellectual generosity. We really appreciate that. And thank you to those of you who are tuning in internationally from all across the world, wherever you are. We appreciate you for attending. And we thank the Nasher for this opportunity to celebrate and to honor our 2023 Nasher Prize Laureate, Senga Ngugi. We are so grateful. I know I can say that for myself, but I think also the panelists and Dr. Jones would also say it's such a pleasure to be here and to celebrate her legacy. So thank you everyone for tuning in, and please have a pleasant rest of your day and weekend.